Now I'm going to create a shape. I'm going to continue from where I started. Now I'm going to create a shape. I'm going to continue from where I left off, right here where the blue stitch ends. So here it looks like I went under the last stitch, so that means that I'm going to start by going over the next stitch. This time I'm only going to weave about 2 inches, and then I'm going to stop and turn around and go back in the opposite direction, ignoring this whole section of my woven canvas here. Pushing up each time. I think one thing that really helps when you're creating a woven tapestry is to use as many different weights of yarn as possible to create some diversity in texture and rhythm. So this is a mercerized cotton that's very fine compared to the wool that I was using up there, but I doubled it over, so I'm actually weaving with 2 threads at a time. So you'll just want to weave until you've got about 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch, until you have a discernible shape. As I'm weaving this, I'm noticing that some of the gray warp wants to show through, and this is really an aesthetic decision. If you want to push it up all the way and not let any of the warp show through, you can. Or if you want to incorporate the warp in your design and have a looser weave structure, that's totally fine too. If you were to create a pillow or a bag or something where you don't want any air pockets showing through, then you'd want to push it up and make a really tight weave structure. Also, it's worth mentioning that the thicker the weight of your warp thread, the thicker this is, the more it will want to show through. If you're using really fine fishing line, let's say, which I do not recommend, but let's just say that I was doing that, that would be completely covered by my weft. So now we have a little shape that's discernible, and I'm going to show you a couple different techniques for how to add a shape next to it and how to join 2 shapes. Okay, so there's my rectangle. It's a pretty basic shape. I'm going to use this turquoise color, and I'm just going to come up again next to it. I'm going to fill in this whole area with turquoise. So what I'm going to do, the first stitch I'm going to show you is tapestry weave. These are all considered tapestry weave. Tapestry weave is essentially when you're joining 2 different shapes side by side. So this tapestry weave, I'm going to weave right up to the shape, turn around, and go in the other direction. And this will create a small gap in between my warp threads, which later will be closed when I weave below it. This tapestry weave is where each weft thread shares a warp. This is called interlocking, and this is where the weft threads go through one another, not through the warp. Each one of these creates a different aesthetic, and it sort of depends on what you're going for, and I can talk about that as we get into it a little bit later. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this first stitch. So I'm just going to ignore the weft and the warp in this shape, and I'm going to start right here. So considering that I went under with the blue, that means that the stitch below needs to start by going over this warp, under the next one. This is a very fine acrylic yarn, so it's going to take a lot of passes. Pushing up each time. I'm just going to turn around and go back in the other direction. This is an especially useful technique if you're trying to create triangle or a very sharp line. Because the edges of the shape are going to be maintained because I'm not puncturing them with a new color. So once you can start to see this effect, I'll move on to the next technique. Okay, so you can see that both the edge of the turquoise triangle and the edge of the, the edge of the turquoise rectangle and the edge of the red rectangle are intact. They both have these straight edges. Now I'm going to show you how to do the second tapestry weave stitch. And this one is a little bit more secure. So what I'm going to do is approximate the height of this red to the height of this turquoise. And I'm actually going to weave over the warp thread that the red is sitting on. And then I'm going to weave back in the other direction. Something to consider here is the weight of yarn. So here, even though they look about the same, this turquoise is a lot thinner in weight than two of the mercerized cottons. So for every one red, I'll need to do 2 stitches of the turquoise. The finer the thread, the more you'll want to pull tightly on the edge, but try to resist that urge. So now that we have 2 stitches of turquoise, I'm going to push it up, and now we'll be weaving in this space right here. Again, I'm going to do 2 passes on that warp thread. If you want to use your combs instead of your fingers, you can do that. I personally just use my fingers. Okay, one more pass here, and then we'll take a look at what that looks like. So here you can start to see that if I were to continue with this stitch, the edges here would appear in a sort of zigzag fashion as they do right here. Now we're going to try interlocking. So I'm going to go weave all the way to the red point again. But this time, instead of weaving on that warp thread, I'm going to pass my needle down through both of the red weft only. Push up. Weave back. This is best done when you're weaving with 2 yarns of equal weight, so that when you're coming to match that yarn they're both growing at the same height, if that makes sense. Go down through both of those. Continue on. Aesthetically, this looks pretty similar to the stitch that we did before, but it can be useful to know how to do. So go ahead and create your shapes, and you can use whichever one of these techniques makes sense for what you're doing. I recommend trying all of them just to get a sense of what each one does and each one looks like. And go ahead and weave until you have two shapes that are at an equal height or equal width.